Welcome to week 4, and had another cheesy melodramatic introduction here. But this is actually one of the best analogies for this topic that we're going to talk about. We're getting into the part of the semester and the part of the material where it really does feel like a real-life Game of Thrones. And this week we're going to be talking about the actors or the strategic approach. You hear both of these terms used. Sometimes it's called the actor-based theory. Sometimes it's called the strategic approach. We use them simultaneously. But it's really focused on the High Lords, the actors and the leaders of the various groups that are important in the decision making. So before we dive into O'Donnell and Schmitter's little book, let's back up and walk through a case study, a short one. But in January 2001, protests erupted in Egypt, including Tahrir Square, where by some accounts, definitely hundreds of thousands of people filled the streets and went to the square to demand that the President Mubarak resign. Egypt was an authoritarian regime at the time. Mubarak was the leader, and these protests were to demand his resignation. By some accounts, it could have been 500,000 or even up to 1 million people who participated in all of the protests in the capital of Egypt and other surrounding cities, but it was really large. And you can see the sign here. This is very typical of what the people would hold out, and they were largely peaceful protests as well. They were just out there to chant, to sing songs, and to hold up signs, all demanding Mubarak leave. The police arrived as they almost always do in these situations. Almost every instance of democratization involves protest, either peaceful or violent, and the police showing up later to try to put it down and force people back to their homes. Violence ensued. A couple of people died. Fortunately, it was not the bloodbath that other regimes have faced in similar situations. So fast forward to February 2011, and the protesters a month later still held Tahrir Square. The police had not been able to push them out. The police and Mubarak supporters began to fight with the protesters, and in what has to be one of the most surreal moments I've ever seen. I remember watching this live when it happened, but some of the Mubarak supporters went plowing into crowds of the protesters, riding camels and beating them with canes. And you can see the picture here. And the Egyptian people, I didn't make this up, the Egyptian people actually call it the Battle of the Camel. And you have to see video of this. I wish I could embed the video and do all that, but it is the most bizarre thing you've ever seen. So it got a little crazy. It got a little weird. Then on February 10th, Mubarak addressed the country in a televised speech. He gave a very defiant speech. He told them, I will not be leaving office. I will not resign. But he gave some concessions. He was going to fill a post vice presidential post that had been vacant, and he offered some concessions to the protesters. But then he turned around and called the people of Egypt his children and was speaking very condescendingly to them. To nobody's surprise, the protesters were not happy about that, and they stayed. But the important thing was that on February 10th, Mubarak said, I am not leaving. And then on February 11th, he resigned. He fled the palace, and the military took control until a new constitution could be written months later. So what happened? Why on February 10th did he say, I'm not leaving, and the next day he was gone? It was not because he feared the protesters. The protesters were not going to storm the palace. The protesters were not going to go in and kill him and his people. That was never a threat during this uprising. The protesters were in Tahrir Square and in other areas around the city. They were playing music, they were holding signs, they were giving speeches, but not once did they ever threaten to actually go in and physically remove or to harm Mubarak. So why did he leave? That's what we're going to try to answer in this short video and this lecture. And that's what O'Donnell and Schmitter help us understand, is what happened in this case that Mubarak, even though he was not under physical threat from the protesters, he still left. One last bit of background. If you think about the last 2 weeks of modernization, you can think about modernization as the long buildup. It creates the conditions in which the demand for democracy builds. it can explain which countries are most likely to have these protests or these revolutions, these to demand the democracy and a say in the government. It doesn't tell us how we get from that demand to an actual democracy and an overthrow of an authoritarian regime. And so we have this long build-up where demand within a country, as it modernizes, as people's values change, and they become more self-expressive, and then demand a say in government. At some point, a revolution breaks out. At some point, enough people decide, we've had enough, we're going to take to the streets, and we're going to demand a say in this government. We're going to demand a transition. What follows that is a period of chaos. The best way to describe it is that it's a period of chaos after all hell breaks loose. You can see videos and pictures of the Arab Spring during this period of time, and this is a period of deep uncertainty. We never know how these revolutions are going to play out. In there were Arab Spring protests all over the Middle East. There were ones in Bahrain, in Iran, in Saudi Arabia, but those countries didn't transition. There were protests in Tunisia and Egypt, and those countries did become democratic. So there's a lot of uncertainty. When O'Donnell and Schmitter in their book talk about uncertainty, that's what they're talking about. This is not a period where we have a lot of predictive accuracy. Their book helps us to focus in on some of the things that can help determine the outcome of this chaos. But keep in mind, when you're watching the next Arab Spring, wherever it is around the globe on television, you never know how it's going to end. Okay, that's the background. Let's get to their theory. We're going to talk about three actors. We're going to add a couple of more in over time, but let's start with three main actors. You have the regime. They want to stay in power. You have the reformers. They want democracy, and they want the regime out. And then you've got the military, and the military becomes a wild card, as we'll talk about. But first, let's focus on the regime and what O'Donnell and Schmitter refer to as a split in the regime. Basically, the regime is often not homogenous. Not everybody in the regime agrees with everybody else in the regime. And so there are two groups that O'Donnell and Schmitter distinguish between. Now, I will tell you that this distinction between what they call hardliners and what they call softliners is one of the most important contributions of this book. Nobody before then had made this distinction, let alone talked about regimes being split. So this is really important. Now, the difference between hardliners and softliners is actually a lot more subtle than it seems. The best way to distinguish them is to focus first on the hardliners. Hardliners support authoritarianism as an ideology. They think it is the best form of government. They actually view the masses as not capable of governing, and they believe themselves to be the proper arbiters and protectors of the country. So they are hardline believers in authoritarianism. That's the hallmark of the hardliners. The softliners are much more pragmatic. They will use oppression and they will support authoritarianism if necessary, if they think that is the best way for them to maintain their wealth and power. These could be oligarchs, or these could just be people of prominent position. It's not the behavior that distinguishes hardliners and softliners. It is the pragmatism, because sometimes softliners will support violence and oppression in order to maintain their power because they think that's the best way to do it. However, if necessary, they will be open to some liberalization. They'll give concessions if they believe that they can still maintain most of their wealth, and that's the best way to do it. So what distinguishes these two groups is that hardliners are ideological in supporting authoritarianism. Softliners are pragmatic, supporting authoritarianism when they think it's the best way for them to maintain their power, but also supporting liberalization if they think that will be a way to preserve most of their wealth and most of their status. Okay, with this distinction made, let's talk about when an opening occurs, when there's an opportunity for transition in a regime. O'Donnell and Schmitter refer to an opening as a situation when these two groups disagree. The hardliners will always support authoritarianism. They don't change. But when the softliners start to believe, hey, we need to get some concessions to these protesters or this opposition group in order so that this doesn't become a full-blown civil war, or worse, that they're going to take over and kick us all out, that creates an opportunity for a transition. So let's go back, and now instead of just the regime, we have hardliners and softliners up there. When the softliners line up with the hardliners, liberalization and transition democracy becomes a lot less likely because you have the entire regime unified against the reformers. We're going to talk about the military here in a second. We're just going to leave them off the side. However, when the softliners offer concessions, and I won't say team up with the reformers, but when they start opening negotiations and conversations with the reformers about the possibility of offering some concessions to them, then liberalization and transition democracy become more likely because the regime is split and the reformers begin finding partners with the softliners in terms of transitioning. Now, what this would mean in reality is that the softliners would have to support the overthrow of the ruler. So in Iraq, for instance, that would have been Saddam Hussein, or in North Korea, that'd be Kim Jong-un. And that person would have to leave office. But in negotiating and compromising with the reformers, it allows the softliners to keep their wealth and status. They're not the ones that are going to be kicked out. They'll use the ruler as a scapegoat and have a slow transition to democracy. That's mostly what this looks like in real life. There's one other actor that we're going to add to this, and that's the police. And this is not an actor that the O'Donnell and Schmitter talk about, and the role of the military is, it's in their book, but it's a lot more subtle. And so the next couple of minutes, I'm going to be highlighting something and in some ways adding to what they're talking about in their book. So first of all, the police are always aligned with the regime in all cases. But the military is not always aligned with the regime. In some cases they are, and it looks kind of like this, where the military, in some, like in Iran and some other countries, the police are a wing of the military. There's no distinction. It's not the police as one entity and the military as a separate entity. They're the same. In the U.S., that seems weird to us because we have an independent military, and then we have local police and even federal police that operate as a completely different organization. Well, in some countries, these two operate the same. And as it turns out, a lot of times a regime in reaction to the reformers will send the military in to put down the demonstrations. This happened most famously in China during the Tiananmen Square protests. You had some pro-democracy reformers who filled up Tiananmen Square, and initially the police came in, but then the regime sent in the military. You can see the picture of the tanks rolling in as everybody tries to flee. And the reality is that the military did successfully put down these protesters, and it was brutal. It was a massacre. Specifically, I'm not going to show this to you, but there are pictures out there of the tanks with tracks of blood trailing them. They literally ran over the protesters with these tanks and like literally crushed them. And it was a massacre, and a lot of people died. Obviously, China did not transition. That should give you a foreshadowing about the role of the military in this transition process. In other instances, the military operates as an independent organization, even from the regime. This was a case in Egypt, for instance, where the military was not an arm of the regime. The police were. The police worked for Mubarak and were loyal to Mubarak, but the military was separate. And that was one of the reasons why the military at the time was so well respected. As it turns out, the military is a very important actor, and their decision during this moment of chaos when protests erupt and there's a revolution and a call for a regime change, what the military does is the determinative factor. So let's talk about that a second. When I say the determinative factor, let's walk through a couple of cases. In Tunisia and Egypt and some other countries, the military was independent of the regime, and in Egypt, the military just stood aside. They let the police and the protesters fight it out. The only time the military actually got involved up until the end was to bring in tanks and put a blockade between the protesters and the police to stop the fighting. So they wouldn't allow the police to go and try to shut down the protest, nor would they allow the protesters to attack the police. Most of the countries where this was the situation, the military was independent and they didn't side with either group, most of those countries actually transitioned to democracy. On the other hand, you have countries like Bahrain, Iran, and some of the others where the military operates as a police function. And the military was sent in, like with Tiananmen Square, to end the protests. And what typically happened here was a very brutal crackdown. Hundreds, sometimes thousands of people died. One of these countries, over 10,000 people were killed by the military in these protests when the military came in. And most importantly, for our understanding of this, not a single one of those countries democratized. None of those countries transitioned. And then finally, let's talk about Libya and Syria, where the military did try to end the protest. In Libya, most famously, the Gaddafi would send military fighter jets to drop actual bombs on the protesters in the opposition. So that was a case where the military tried to end the protest. However, instead of going home or instead of just being killed, the reformers and the protesters and the opposition group to those regimes, they picked up arms and they started shooting back, and they militarized themselves. And what resulted was neither democracy nor authoritarian rule, but a very prolonged, bloody, violent civil war that actually in Syria still goes on to this day. You hear a lot about Assad dropping chemical weapons, a criticism that the Assad regime in Syria got for dropping chemical weapons on civilians. Well, that's what that's about, is that is the lingering, the people he's attacking are the opposition group that broke off and became the rebels in this very bloody, protracted civil war that began from the protest during the Arab Spring. So let's back up and kind of walk through the logic of this one more time. A good rule of thumb, there's going to be another wave of democratization. Can't tell you when, I can't tell you what part of the country is going, or what part of the world it's going to be, but there will be another wave of democratization like the Arab Spring. When that happens, you're going to see the protesters, the people holding signs, demonstrating, you're going to see the police come in, or the military, you're going to see them come in and try to put it down. The key actor to watch is the military, because they, again, are the determinative factor about who wins these games of thrones. When the military is independent of the regime, democratization is going to be a lot more likely to succeed, especially if the military stays out or they side with the opposition group, with the reformers. On the other hand, when the military is a direct function of the regime, when it engages in police activities instead of being limited to national security and national defense, you only get one of two outcomes. Either it's going to be a failure to democratize as the military puts down the protest and people go home and decide to live under the current regime, or you have a bloody, violent civil war. There is not a whole lot of opportunities, there's not a whole lot of scenarios that play out in between these three. So again, it shows you the role of the military. And once again, this is not something that is necessarily made explicit in the O'Donnell and Schmitter book, but it is very important. I wanted to highlight it. All of this is there. You just kind of have to cobble it together. All right, let's talk about one last topic. This is the second biggest contribution of O'Donnell and Schmitter to our understanding of democratization. It's possibly the most counterintuitive concept that we'll run into, because watching on television the Arab Spring or the colored revolutions in the Baltics and Eastern Europe or any of these other waves of democratization, this is a part of it you don't see. It's not part of the public negotiations or the public discussion, and certainly not reported in the news. Now, I'm going to go on what I call a quote-a-thon. I'm going to read you a lot of quotes from their books. The quotes are not important. Understand that the idea is important. I mean, the quotes are all in the book. You're going to read the book, so you're going to see these again. I'm just trying to highlight the central idea behind this very counterintuitive concept. So, what is a pact? It is, quote, an explicit agreement among a select set of actors which seeks to define rules governing the exercise of power on the basis of mutual guarantees for the vital interests of those entering into it. Basically, it's a negotiation between those actors. Remember the 4 or 5 actors we've been talking about? It's a negotiation among them for transition, for changes in the rules of governing and the rules of power. Each side gives up something, they make some concessions to one another, but it is an arrangement or a negotiated agreement. To quote the book again, such arrangements permit a polity to change its institutional structure without violent confrontation and or the predominance of one group over the other. Basically, they're trying to avoid violent confrontation. The regime can appeal to the military to get involved. The reformers could actually appeal to the military to get involved, as they did in Egypt during the Arab Spring. And the protesters can resort to violence as well. And both sides say, okay, we're not going to do that. We're going to talk this out. And we're going to come to an understanding that's mutually beneficial for everybody, to all of our vital interests. So basically, it's an agreement by the regime, the opposition, the military, the reformers, and everybody else that governs the rules of the transition. The regime gives up power, but also gets concessions. And sometimes this doesn't involve the regime immediately leaving office. Sometimes it can be a negotiation about the timeline. The regime says, okay, stop the protest, go home. 3 years from now, we'll be out of, we'll hand over power to a new group and we'll work this out. So it can be something along those lines, but the regime does have to give up something in terms of liberalization, having elections for some offices, or some other concession to the protesters. And this is the important part, this next quote. Ironically, such modern pacts move the polity towards democracy by undemocratic means. They are typically negotiated among a small number of participants representing established groups or institutions. In other words, they're not going to democracy immediately. They're having these behind-the-scenes, backdoor deals with the leaders of the opponents and the leaders of the regime, the leaders of the military, and all of the other relevant actors. They come to an agreement. That's not something that's voted on by the public, and the public may not even know about this. Oftentimes these pacts are not publicized, and the leaders of the opposition do not come out and say, okay, we got this covered. So this is something that is really interesting in that you can have a shift to democracy using very undemocratic means that resolves a conflict in a stable and less violent way. So let's do a quick overview just to kind of boil all this down to the main part. First of all, the regime can harm the opponents and the reformers. They can use the police to attack them. They could use oppression to put them in jail. Even if they went home and stopped protesting, they could still go after them. They could take away their jobs. A lot of these regimes, people's jobs depend on loyalty to the regime. Or they could get the military involved and kill every single one of them. The opposition can harm the regime as well, especially if it wins. The opposition can appeal to the military to go take out the leadership, have a military coup. Or if the opposition ends up winning, they could then go back and prosecute members of the regime, including things like the death penalty for atrocities or things that they did in office. So the opposition is also a threat to the regime. A pact is basically them getting together, say, okay, let's agree not to harm each other and negotiate a settlement to this. We need to figure this out in a way that doesn't result in either of us ending up getting hurt or dying. Now, O'Donnell and Schmitter talk about negotiating pacts and forming pacts through 3 moments. It's easy to read this chapter and their discussion about these 3 different moments as this being sequential, right? First you have the military moment, then the political moment, then the economic moment. As O'Donnell and Schmitter recognize, the real life is actually a lot messier. This is a conceptual tool, and sometimes some of these moments happen simultaneously. You can negotiate a military pact and a political pact at the same time. Or you could do all 3 of them, or you may only have one of them. Right? So the real life's messy. Don't think of these as moments that happen in any type of sequential order. As it turns out, they can happen simultaneously or out of the order that we're going to talk about them. And you're going to need to read chapter 4 and take good notes about each one of these three moments. I'm going to describe it as a way to tell you what to focus on. But this is absolutely, I'm not going to cover all of the, I'm not going to get into the details of each one of these moments. Basically, the military moment is designed to get the military back to the barracks. If the military is in charge, if it's a military junta, then the idea is to get them out of the policymaking role. They're no longer going to be governing the country, they're going to be watching out for the national defense. If they're an actor in, for instance, as the military stepped into in between the protesters and the police in Egypt, it's to try to get them back to the barracks and out of the streets, to remove the military as a determinant of who wins the conflict. The second is a political moment. Basically, the goal is to get parties to compete in elections. This might seem like democracy, and sometimes it is, right? Sometimes a political moment results in actual democracy, but in some cases it's not full-blown elections. It's not a full-blown transition democracy. What might happen is we're going to have elections for a third of the representatives in the new parliament that the pact is going to create, and those are going to be Democratic. But then a third of the parliament is going to be filled with representatives from the military, and a third is going to be represented by people from the regime. So it doesn't have to be full-blown democracy, but the idea is to start the process of getting competitive elections in some form. And then finally is the economic moment, and this is to get all the economic actors to agree on the rules of the game. Right? For instance, companies versus unions, they have to agree on how they're going to resolve their conflict and their differences. The unions want higher pay, the companies don't want to give them higher pay. How are they going to resolve that? And that's often part of a new regime, especially in countries, developing countries, where the military controlled a large sector of the economy. This happened in Indonesia, which was not a military junta, but the military was a big actor, and Suharto, the former dictator, would oftentimes give business contracts to members of the military to maintain their loyalty, make them very rich so that they'd be loyal to him. Well, when you transition from that, you can't have the military still controlling all the businesses, and so you have to create this economic pact. So those are three pacts. Go read in more detail from Chapter 4 about these moments and the different compromises they entail. But lastly, I want to talk about one really interesting implication that we're going to talk about in our online discussion, which is the military pact, or this military moment. What if you have a situation where the military or the police committed atrocities? This is actually quite common around the world in authoritarian regimes, especially military juntas where the military controls all of government. You don't have, for instance, like China is overseen by a communist party and the military serves under them. Well, in some countries like Burma, the military is the government itself. And in those countries, a lot of times the military commits some pretty atrocious acts of human rights abuses. What do you do with that? Well, if the military hands over power, or if, let's say that in Iran, if the rulers, the governing regime, they are handed over power to democratic reformers, the military could still be prosecuted for the things they've done, the human rights abuses. And in this case, a pact might actually shield them from prosecution if they give up power. The idea behind this, which again is deeply counterintuitive, is that military generals are not going to sign their own death sentence. And dictators and other authoritarian rulers are not going to sign their own death sentence. They're not stupid, right? They're not dumb. If they think that handing over control to democracy means that the new incoming government turns around and prosecutes them, and they even, so they'll lose their wealth, they'll lose their status, they could be thrown in jail, or they could be given the death penalty, they're not going to hand over power. They have nothing to lose. So in that situation, they have nothing to lose. And so a lot of times you have to negotiate a pact that basically tells them, well, we're not going to prosecute you for what you've done. Which brings up one of the trickiest and most sensitive aspects of this whole negotiated pact thing, which is that justice? You've got victims who either themselves or their family members have been tortured, have been abused, have been oppressed for years. They want justice. And frankly, they deserve justice. But on the other hand, if you threaten the military and the former rulers too much, then they might back out of the agreement and go, hey, look, I hand over power to you, you're going to kill me. I'm not going to do that. We're going to do something else. So it begs the question, is democracy more or less important than getting justice for human rights abuses? That's a really tricky situation. There's no simple answer to that, and hopefully we'll be able to talk about it in depth during the discussions. So let's go back to Egypt real quick, where we started. As I mentioned, in Egypt, the military operated as an independent institution. The military at the time was actually beloved by the Egyptian people. The Egyptian protesters were railing against the police that was under the arm of Mubarak. They actually loved the military, and they begged the military to get involved in this. But the military stood aside, and they allowed the protests to go on. They got in between the police and the protesters, and they largely stayed out of the fray until February 11th. That's when the military intervened against Mubarak. And to say that they intervened, I don't mean they stormed the palace and started shooting people. I mean the generals and the military leaders walked into the palace, walked up to Mubarak, and gave him what has to be a message that's very similar to this, which is, President Mubarak, you're out of here. You are no longer the president, and you have a choice. You can either get in your car, get in a plane, and leave on your own, or you can leave in a wooden box. And that was that behind-the-scenes thing that was never seen on television. That was a conversation that you didn't see if you're watching CNN or Fox News or Al Jazeera or any of the media outlets covering the Arab Spring. You didn't see the military walk into the palace and say, we're done here, you're gone. And then and then they said, and we're in control now, and we're going to run this government until we can get a constitution and have a transition. So I hope that you have a better idea about what the actor/strategic theory is about, and what things to look for the next wave of democratization, which will happen. It may not be this year, it may be 5 years from now, but there'll be another one, and hopefully you're better equipped to watch. Go read the O'Donnell and Schmitter book, and we'll talk about it later. But there is one last thing I want to do, which is we need to amend the Game of Thrones analogy. We started out with a quote, and we start out, of course, with the Rains of Castamere. If you're a fan of the show, you recognize the music. But we need to amend that quote a little bit if we're going to properly apply it to democratization, which is, when you play the Game of Thrones, you win or you die, or you negotiate a pact. Have a good one, and talk to you next time.